My name is Arthur Delaney. People in my town called me lucky because I'd built 2 companies and sold them before. I turned 60. They didn't know the worst part of luck. The way it convinced you people were on your side. Until one morning, the balance sheet told a different story. It began as a bad habit. I read financial memos at 2 a.m., the way other men read novels. Numbers were soothing. Clean lines. Predictable outcomes. That night, a line in a vendor ledger read, like a small rock thrown into still water. Consulting Brantley LLC. I squinted at the vendor list. Brantley wasn't a vendor. Brantley was not in our vendor database, not a name our procurement team had ever used. At first I assumed oversight. Treasury errors happen. People type wrong codes. I called the CFO in the morning, asked for the supporting invoice. He read it aloud, with the kind of practiced calm executives use when they don't want panic to spread. Brantley is a strategic partner, he said. Contract pending. That phrase should have sounded comforting. Instead, it felt like a door closing. I went to the server. Invoices, payments, memos, a tangle of PDFs. Somewhere, in those digital folds, the logic that binds a company had been disturbed. The sum total of small, normalized corruptions often looks innocent. An odd vendor here, a late-night expense there, a handshake nobody logged. But a pattern is a thing that sits and waits until someone reads it properly. So I started reading, not with the irritation of an old man who thinks new accounting software is annoying, but with the methodical hunger I'd once used to find margins in markets. I printed the Brantley invoice on my home printer. The ink dried quickly. I circled dates, amounts, signatories. My pulse had a slow, sure rhythm. If this was oversight, it was a careless one. If it was theft, it was obvious to anyone who bothered to look. That evening, standing in my kitchen, I opened a fresh document and typed 3 words as a header. Legacy Audit Plan. The phrase tasted dangerous in my mouth. I felt the old thrill, the same tool set that built companies could be used to dismantle fraud. I would not storm in wildly. I would measure at the meter. I would build an audit that left nothing to chance. And so, in the dark of my study, I began to gather the ledger that would not let them spin it away. The more I looked, the less these were small things. The Brantley payments were a thread, and once pulled, the cloth unfurled. There were vendor names that only appeared at odd hours, expense codes that matched no line item in any approved budget, and reimbursements noted in casual language, client hospitality, with receipts that belonged to boutique hotels across state lines. I mapped dates against travel itineraries. There it was again, a private dinner in Miami the week a junior associate resigned, a strategy retreat in New York, aligned with a mid-level analyst, vanishing from the roster. I was surprised at how tidy the pattern could be when you lined up dates on a spreadsheet. Numbers, like people, seldom lie when asked plainly. I reached out quietly to Priya, the travel coordinator, under the pretense of updating contact lists. She blinked at the mention of Brantley, then excused herself. An hour later, a folder slid under my office door. Inside, folios. Folios hotel receipts blessed with nonsensical vendor names. Itineraries that showed empty seats reserved at odd hours. She had a laptop teardown of calendar metadata and was as careful as I was startled. Then there were the small human things. Zoe, who once ran client pitches with a surgeon's focus, had left the firm with a terse resignation. She wrote in one paragraph that she'd been encouraged to take a step back. After she pushed back on a last-minute mentorship dinner, Lila, younger and quieter, had a voicemail she'd kept a late night, slurred invitation from an off-duty executive. People leave traces when they leave in a hurry. I began to copy everything to an encrypted drive. Then I made notarized prints, the kind of conservative steps my lawyer friends laughed at until they needed them. Evidence I'd learned over the years was not simply what you had, it was how you preserved it. Metadata, timestamps, chain of custody. Small bureaucratic rituals that made stories survive cross-examination. I told myself it was a puzzle worth solving for the company's good. I told myself I would be reasonable, that I would catch an honest mistake and move on. But that last rationalization felt thin. I was not chasing numbers for sport. I was chasing a pattern that could ruin more people than the balance sheet and perhaps ruin the future of a company I'd staked my name on. Late one rain-slick night, I titled the next section in my document, Coalition. If there was a pattern, there would be more victims than I could stand to bear alone. You don't form a coalition in a conference room with banners. You form it at kitchen tables and in coffee shops, where colleagues can lean close and speak without cameras. I began with small, safe inquiries. A text to Zoe framed as concern, a casual lunch invite to Priya, under the excuse of catching up. These were my reconnaissance missions. Zoe looked older than her 38 years when we met. She set down her cup and said 2 words. He did it. Not a confession, not a plea, an assertion. She handed me an email chain where strategic mentorship had been a euphemism for pressure. Lila, nervous but steady, played me the voicemail she'd saved on her phone, the one where a senior partner's voice slurred, either because of wine or because he thought his position let him speak however he liked. I learned to listen in the particular way a man who has measured balance sheets learns to listen to markets, not for the sound of panic, but for the cadence of truth. Priya's contributions were more forensic. She forwarded hotel folios, the kind of paperwork most people misplace. Folios that showed payments routed through shell vendors. Folios whose invoice numbers didn't match any legitimate procurement system. She had the patience to piece together the calendar metadata so we could show not just that a meeting happened, but exactly when and where. Then I called Ava. I'd met her once at a seminar on governance. She was a lawyer who didn't soften facts with florid speeches. "You have pattern," she said, after 10 minutes of my breathless inventory. Patterns can be boxes in court, but you must preserve chain of custody and be prepared this will be a fight. Her bluntness was a kind of comfort. We set rules. No one would talk to HR, no one would post anything online. All communications with us would be documented and backed up off-site. We created redundant archives, encrypted cloud copies, USB drives sealed into a safe deposit box. Every document got a timestamp. Every voicemail got exported in multiple formats and notarized where possible. We rehearsed our statements like we were preparing a pitch to investors. Brevity. Fact first, no flourish. Ava's voice cut across our small group like a bell. If you are going to do this, you do it as a dossier. People listen to dossiers. They don't listen to gossip. So we built a dossier. It grew into something heavier than paperwork. It felt like a ledger of moral accounting. Each invoice, each hotel folio, each resignation note was another entry tied not to profit, but to responsibility. The coalition, composed of Zoe, Priya, Lila, and me, began to feel less like a ragtag band and more like a board with a mission. And in the margins of my audit, I wrote the clause I would need to reconfigure the company's governance, a procedural hinge that would let me apply legal leverage if certain anomalies were triggered. They would never read it closely. They never did. You learn, over decades of building companies, where to place a lever so no one notices it until you pull. That's what the clause was. A small, legal hinge I inserted under the guise of routine governance updates. I called it an enhanced fiduciary oversight protocol, in a memo that read like every other memo our board received. I walked into the next board meeting with a folder that smelled faintly of printer ink and intent. The change was framed as an update, good governance, founder oversight in legacy transition. They nodded. Partners often sign papers with trust brittle as glass. I emphasized continuity and compliance, and they applauded what looked like prudence. Privately, attorneys reviewed the language. We placed limitations, triggers, and thresholds, a combination of odd vendor codes, unexplained transfers, and sudden departures that, when met, would automatically call for an independent committee with extraordinary auditing powers. It would be a mechanism that removed plausible deniability and forced transparency. Then we seeded a leak, not a scandalous one, An innocuous note in an investor update about a forthcoming strategic consulting engagement with a vendor. In any other company memo, it would have been a footnote. In our case, it was bait. Douglas, the partner who preferred shortcuts to stewardship, took the bait. Greed is quick. Governance is slow. The shell vendors began to receive larger transfers that very week. The transactions lacked subtlety. They hit the triggers I had coded in, exactly as planned. The oversight protocol, which had seemed like a bureaucratic nicety, snapped into life. When the board convened following the automatic flagging, cameras were not yet involved. The meeting was clinical, a series of spreadsheets, highlighted lines, and quiet revelations. I presented the data in the dry language accountants understand dates, transaction IDs, corroborating itineraries, voices that once changed. The direction of meetings now sought, the comfort of legal counsel. I remember Martin, my son, sitting there with the kind of brittle composure people use in courtrooms. He said the words you expect. Misunderstanding, poor bookkeeping. We'll correct it. But the numbers were impatient. The oversight committee had enough to freeze certain accounts, and that freeze closed the valves Douglas had been opening. We had engineered a trap not to humiliate, but to let law and governance do their job, to force restitution and remove control from those who abused it. That was the point, to replace family loyalty with institutional accountability. On the day the committee reported, the boardroom was a different animal. Where lunches and strategic handshakes usually took place, there now sat lawyers, printed affidavits, and the low, brittle sounds of people realizing the ground had shifted beneath them. I laid out the ledger piece by piece, Brantley invoices, notarized copies, travel folios, the chain of emails that connected payments to shell entities. I let the silence grow between slides. That silence is a tool. It takes the place of shouting when you want people to think. Martin's face changed by degrees, first flinty, then tight, then pale. Douglas attempted to speak. His words were rehearsed, the same lines he used with investors when a product launch floundered. But rehearsed narratives are thin when confronted with a paper trail that ties signatures to dates and dates to people. The committee recommended immediate measures. Freeze the accounts in question. Appoint forensic accountants. Empty the executive control privileges temporarily. The board, with its fingers suddenly hovering over corporate risk, had no appetite to bicker. The optics of defending a founder's son against a founder's evidence would be terrible. Outside, news hadn't broken, and I allowed myself that small, private satisfaction. I had no illusions about vindictiveness. This was about restoring balance. The board, who had once deferred to the partners with a certain social grace, now asked me questions with the respect you reserve for an adversary. After the meeting, Martin cornered me in the hallway. His voice trembled with something I hadn't heard since he was a boy pleading for an extra toy. "Dad, we can fix this. I didn't know it was that bad." It is, I thought. A son's confession doesn't repair a ledger. We did not press for his immediate criminal referral. We demanded restitution and oversight. The company was our shared creation. Destroying it would destroy more livelihoods than it would save. Yet, the board acted decisively. Control removed from implicated partners, repayment plans and clawbacks initiated, legal proceedings prepared as needed. People asked if I'd enjoyed the reveal. Enjoyment implies cruelty. What I felt was something else, a long taking of breath. The house I had helped build could breathe again, if the careful hands of governance were allowed to do their work. Confrontations with family are grinders in slow motion. They are not the dramatic showdowns of cinema. They happen at kitchen tables with coffee going cold. Martin came to my house that night, and we sat at the old table my father had oiled for decades. He was smaller than I remembered. A man can be ruined by ego, but he can also be diminished by regret. The two are close cousins. "Dad," he said, around a mouth Hat once smiled with business confidence. "I thought I was protecting the company. We were making moves." His voice ran on the easy terms he had honed with lawyers. "You were protecting your partner's greed," I said. I did not want the theatrics of raised voices. The ledger had been loud enough. He tried to explain late payments to consultants, expedited vendor wires to close deals, a line about keeping momentum. The words scratched like poor pens. Somewhere between one sentence and the next, you could see what had happened. Shortcuts had become an alternative ethic. I listened, because the father in me still listened, and because I had to know whether this was stupidity or malice. He pleaded. Martin was not a monster. He was a man who had let impatience govern his judgment. That difference mattered in court. It mattered in family. It mattered when determining restitution. We spoke for hours. He offered to step down, to seek outside help, to make amends. I wanted to believe him, but belief is not enough to unpick years of compromised choices. The company required accountability, not apologies. When he left that night, it was with a cry that sounded like more than desperation. It sounded like a man losing a map he had trusted. I sat alone at the table and signed the final clause of the oversight. Protocol I'd authored a last, quiet act of repair. The papers were boring legal language, clauses and indemnities, but they were levers that would hold. I arranged for the board to open a path for restitution that prioritized the company's solvency and employee stability. We did not seek ruin for Martin. We sought repair for the wrongs done. But if restitution failed, the law would follow. That was the point. To replace family evasions with institutional rules that could not be bent by affection. The months that followed felt like a patient grinding machine doing work behind the scenes. Forensic accountants traced wires to shell accounts and back again. Legal counsel negotiated clawbacks and structured settlements. The partners who had skirted governance lost privileges. Martin kept his head down. He made payments. Douglas found himself answering questions he had never faced publicly. When the board accepted the final remediation plan, there was a strange, small ceremony. We signed documents in a conference room with glass walls. The press was kept at bay. Governance had to be allowed to work without theater. The company emerged bruised but intact. The accounts closed the gaps. Clawbacks returned money to the Treasury. Reforms were written into policy so the loopholes that had allowed Brantley to exist could no longer be used. I had been careful all along to keep a separate personal plan in motion. The week the remediation was finalized, I sat with my lawyer and drew a new will. The company had been my life's labor, but by then my goals had changed. I did not want my estate to become a playground for opportunists. Nor did I want the company to be entangled with my family disputes after I was gone. So I rewrote the legacy in legal terms. I created a community trust meant to seed healthcare initiatives. The original mission the startup served. I placed conditions on executive succession and strengthened the company's oversight bodies. Those clauses had one function: to ensure stewardship over profit and to mandate accountability. When I told Martin, his face registered something that looked like acceptance mixed with loss. He was allowed a path back into civic life, but not into control. That was perhaps the cruelest mercy. I could grant a way to be part of rebuilding without granting the keys to the safe. Later, when reporters asked whether the restitution had been revenge, I said what I'd thought at the beginning. I felt responsible. Responsibility meant I used whatever leverage. I had to restore the institution to the purpose I had intended when I first invested, my time and name. In the end, money did not cure what had broken between us. But the company was no longer a conduit for family favors. It belonged, in law and practice, to the community of people who made it function. Years compress and change meaning. I still wake at odd hours and check spreadsheets the way some people read the paper. It's a habit that keeps me honest and, oddly, gives me a sense of order. The company is different now, more transparent, more guarded, less susceptible to the kinds of informal arrangements that once prospered in corners. Echoes of that time arrive in small ways. A former partner called to apologize and never fully regained his industry stature. Martin volunteers now at a clinic the trust funds. He's quieter there, present in a way that isn't performative. Sometimes he brings sandwiches and sits at the back of a meeting, content to listen rather than command. Perhaps that is restitution of a human kind. And I I spend afternoons mentoring young founders who ask me how to avoid the mistakes that ruin companies as much as greed does. One of the first things I tell them is banal but true. Build systems, not personalities. The best governance is architecture that removes the need for saints and exposes the capacity for sinners. People ask if I regret the hard line I took. The answer is no. There are regrets, small, private ones about dinners missed and the way trust was broken. But regret and responsibility are different. Regret asks for comfort. Responsibility asks for corrections. At 70, I planted a sapling near the community clinic funded by the trust. It is a maple stubborn, patient, and slow to prove itself. I watch it in spring when leaves unfurl like promises. Maybe that is vanity, or maybe it is simply a small symbol of what steadier hands and clearer books can do. When the young founders ask what revenge tastes like, I smile. Revenge? I tell them. It doesn't taste like anything noble. It tastes like ledger paper and coffee at dawn. It tastes like the sound of a clause you wrote working the way it should. They laugh, half uncomfortable, half understanding. If there was a final lesson in the ledger, it is this: institutions, correctly designed, can outlast people's worst impulses. You cannot prevent every failing in human nature, but you can make it so the structures people inherit are built to protect the vulnerable and preserve purpose. I closed the file called Legacy Audit and, at last, filed it under a folder labeled Resolved. The ledger remained, not as a weapon, but as a record. One person's effort to turn betrayal into accountability and anger into a durable plan for the future.